Welcome back. We're talking about NATO's latest strategic moves following a two-day meeting in Warsaw. Let's get back to our panel. Victor, the NATO summit also reaffirmed its commitment to Afghanistan. In fact, it decided to maintain a military presence there and commit $5 billion per year to fund Afghan security forces. Now, China is also committed to Afghans, or at least the Afghanistan development and security. So is it likely we're going to see some cooperation between China and NATO in Afghanistan?
Well, I do hope China and NATO can have some meaningful cooperation. But as far as the situation in Afghanistan is concerned, the US and NATO war in Afghanistan is a complete disaster. It has not solved any problem in Afghanistan in any meaningful way. Therefore, I don't think it will be worthwhile for China to cooperate with NATO as far as the war situation in Afghanistan is concerned. But allow me to add very quickly one point about what the ambassador was just now saying about countries willingly joining NATO. In the early 1960s, when the former Soviet Union based the missiles in Cuba, Cuba was happy to accept these missiles. Why should the United States obstruct that? Why should the United States set up a quarantine to keep the missile from Cuba? Of course, the United States felt threatened if the Soviet Union kept their missiles in Cuba. It's the same thing. If NATO want to acquire countries like Georgia, I bet that Russia will stand up and firmly oppose that. If NATO want to expand into Ukraine, Russia will fight against that. If NATO want to include countries like Mongolia into NATO, both China and Russia will fight against that and will keep Mongolia. Why? Because when expanding, the presence of NATO threatened other countries. China does not want to have a member or a neighbor joining NATO, which brings NATO to China's doorstep. We do not want to have NATO on our doorstep. That's the same reason for President Kennedy to decide to keep the Soviet missiles away from Cuba. Therefore, don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. That's the same philosophy, I would say.
Ambassador?
Well, the fundamental difference between your Beijing guest and I is that he is saying that China or Russia have a right to tell other countries what they can do. And what I'm saying is that neither China, neither Russia, neither the US has a right to tell other countries what they can do.
But he made the point that that is exactly what the United States...
No, what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis was Russian missiles, and it was treated as a bilateral US-Russia issue, or Soviet missiles, and a US-Soviet issue where we wanted to see those missiles withdrawn, and they were withdrawn. It wasn't about Cuba.
Vladimir Goltsin, I want to talk about Ukraine for a moment. The NATO Secretary General also said that a stable, democratic Ukraine is central to Europe's security. How does Russia view that, and what does Russia think NATO wants to do in Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine under Yanukovych wasn't an ideal place at all. There are a lot of legitimate grievances. People were not happy with his rule. He was corrupt, and so on. However, when the United States decided to interfere and decided to sponsor a coup which occurred in Kiev, they more or less generated a civil war. What we have in Ukraine is the western part of Ukraine, which wants a particular way of government, particular language, particular culture to be imposed on the eastern Ukraine, which is not happy with it. So once Yanukovych was out, a particular regime was installed, sponsored by Victoria Nuland, who said Yats should be in charge, and so on. And these people began to dominate, and they wanted to impose their will on the eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was clearly not happy about it. Of course, Russia realized that with this civil war emerging, they should make sure that they protect their fleet, they should protect their sort of historical place in Crimea, and they acted, and I think they acted absolutely rationally. Furthermore, people in Crimea agreed with it. They wanted to get out of this mess. What U.S. is doing recently, or NATO, or all this, newly emerged blocs are doing, is creating havoc and civil wars. Look at Iraq, again, the same thing. The situation wasn't, ideal. The ruler, Saddam Hussein, wasn't ideal. But what we have is civil war. So Ukraine is still going on. And what I find fascinating, that nobody wants to acknowledge it. They try to say that, the Kiev bombing of eastern Ukraine is some kind of an attempt to fend off Russian aggression. This is not. Everybody should send their correspondence and talk to people, and they would tell you how much they resent this Kiev government. So what we have is a situation of civil war. Russia is trying to sort of, obviously sort of help one side, or at least prevent them from being killed. Kiev is trying to get new weapons, new advisors, new help from NATO. So NATO is playing not a peaceful role, not a defensive role, but in fact the role which it's been doing recently, by creating havoc in the Middle East and Ukraine and, in Georgia.
Victor, part of the new initiatives that NATO also announced after the summit was that there'd be a new joint intelligence and security division to respond to evolving threats, as the summit put it. Now, taken with the rest of the announcements that were made coming out of Warsaw, what's your overall reaction?
Well, I think if NATO wants to play a positive role in fighting against global terrorism, for example, of course, all the other countries, including China, probably will be happy to cooperate with NATO when they strengthen their security arrangement. However, the concern is that NATO may actually use this as an excuse so that they may beef up their capabilities, which other countries may find them as a threat to their survival and national security. And in that sense, I think NATO should really be more tempered in their desire to become an instrument of war or military adventure, because in the longer term, philosophically speaking, whichever entity, including NATO, which wants to indulge in the fantasy that they can use military means to prevail against other countries, it may just force the other side, including Russia, to team up with other countries and become redoubly stronger. So therefore, the prospect of a major arms race is real. It may bankrupt some countries. Overreaching by any empire will eventually cause the corruption and the collapse of their own regime.
Very quickly, Victor, there are some who argue that NATO is obsolete, and among those who argue that NATO is obsolete, as we've heard, is the current Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump. He questions its usefulness in a post-Cold War era. Do you agree?
I think NATO is obsolete. Why? Because the Europeans are now talking about setting up their own army, the European-based army. I think that will be a much better way, because European countries do not want to be held hostage by the ideological pursuit of other major powers embodied in NATO. I think European countries should have their own army.
Ambassador, one other issue. When we look at the wide range of threats that countries face around the world, arguably ISIL poses a huge threat. Its members have attacked at least 2 European countries. We saw attacks in France, we saw attacks in Belgium as well. What is NATO doing about that?
Unfortunately, very little. And I wish that NATO was playing a more active role. The problem, as I see it, with dealing with ISIL is that we have a United States that has been very reluctant to really take the fight to ISIL. We've been very limited in the means that we're willing to use, aerial bombing, but not much else. And we have a very fractured coalition. We have a coalition, but a very fractured coalition when you talk about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, maybe Russia. Russia's helping the Assad regime, but says it's also against ISIL. Jordan, the United States. Iran is helping the Assad regime as well. Unclear how much they're going against ISIL. So we have a very fractured approach to dealing with them. In that situation, NATO is really going to be unable to do more than this coalition itself is able to do together. It's not going to be able to step over that and take a lead in some way. So I think NATO is actually playing a rather ineffective role at the moment compared to what it could do.